Institute, which seeks to educate rabbis about halakhic solutions to the agunah problem, women who are chained to a marriage they don't want to be in. His writings on contemporary Jewish thought and Zionism have appeared in the Lehrhaus, Arutz Sheva, and Akdamot. His forthcoming book, Torah Goes Forth from Zion, Essays on the Thought of Rav Kook and Rav Shagar, will be published in the fall. Oh, I didn't even know about that. Amazing. Before making aliyah, he served as the rabbi of Cedar Sinai Synagogue in Cleveland, Ohio. He has taught in a variety of adult educational settings, such as the Wexner Heritage Program and the Hartman Institute. He received his rabbinic ordination from Rabbi Zalman, Nechemia Goldberg. He should have a refuah shlema. He's in the hospital in critical condition.
He actually passed away just about an hour or two ago.
Oh my goodness, really? Oh, Baruch Dayan Emet. Oh, wow.
The Shagar should be for his, Ilui Neshama.
Oh, wow. Okay. And is it public what he passed of?
I don't know.
Okay. Okay. So, okay. Thank you for sharing that. So his ordination is from Reb Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, who just passed away an hour ago, and from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, where I also studied. And knowing Zach well, he's not only a mensch, but a great scholar. And so this is a wonderful opportunity to think about an issue that we oftentimes don't get beyond Rambam's hierarchy of tzedakah or something, but to think on a really deep level. So with that, please join me in welcoming on your muted applause, but you can you can clap while you're muted, Rabbi Zachary Truboff. Shalom, shalom. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Rav Shmuley. And the learning that we do together should be Le'ilui Nishmat Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, who was a truly great scholar and rabbi and rabbinic leader who dedicated his efforts to helping others that were often excluded by even his own community. Just a tremendously humble and giving individual. So we're going to be looking at this topic of re-examining our moral obligation to the other. And I want to start by saying everybody has an other. Everybody has somebody outside their moral circle, their moral concern, whether we like to admit it or not. And I think in our current moment, when we live in a time of such great uncertainty, and there's so much polarization both in America and around the world, what often happens is people hunker down all the more so in different ideological camps. And anybody who's outside of our particular camp is often viewed as the enemy who potentially threatens our own way of life. It's easy in moments like our own to really just pull in and to dedicate our moral energies only to those who think like us, who look like us, who act like us, who hold our values. But I think that this would actually be deeply problematic. And it's something Chazal, the rabbis of the Talmud, understood. And it's something they grappled with again and again throughout a wide variety of rabbinic texts. In this shiur, we're going to look at a series of agadot that relate to the mitzvah of tzedakah, but we're going to look at them through the lens of three very different thinkers. Emmanuel Levinos, great French philosopher, Slavoj Zizek, another great philosopher and cultural critic and very provocative in his own right, and the great Hasidic Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Each one of them offers a very interesting and provocative lens about this question of why we exclude certain others from our moral concern and what we can do to address this problem, and specifically how tzedakah might enable us to address this problem. So to begin our thinking on this, we're going to look at a piece from the Mishnah and the Gemara, one that raises essential questions about tzedakah. They appear in Masechet Bava Batra. Masechet Bava Batra is in Seder Nezikin, which focuses on damages, tort laws. The first chapter of Bava Batra actually deals with laws related to neighbors who live in the same courtyard. And the first chapter deals with questions such as where can walls be built on the shared property and where can trees be planted, knowing that a tree in one place might interfere with a neighbor's property elsewhere. But the Mishnah we're going to look at deals with this question or this issue that neighbors can force other neighbors to build a gatehouse for the courtyard. And the Mishnah opens up by saying that the neighbors may coerce one of the other neighbors to participate in the building of a gatehouse for the courtyard. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel just adds that not all courtyards need a gatehouse. But the straightforward reading of the Mishnah is that a courtyard can have a gate, and you can actually force other people who live in your block to do this. And again, if you live in suburbia, you don't really have these kind of sort of like gated communities, right? Because every house is on its own plot of land. But in the times of the Talmud, people lived in a much more crowded environment, multiple buildings, like sort of offset of a courtyard. And under those conditions, a gatehouse could be built, and you could force others to build it. Now, it's interesting when you get to the Gemara there. It seems to somewhat question or at least undermine, perhaps, the conclusion of the Mishnah that you can force other people in the courtyard to build this gatehouse. And the Gemara says as follows. It says, the Mishnah seems to indicate that a gatehouse is an improvement. It's a good thing. Because if it wasn't a good thing, why else would you be able to force other people in your neighborhood to build it? However, the Gemara questions that a gatehouse is a good thing because it says that there was a case where a certain pious man, a chassid, who lived in a particular neighborhood, what would happen is Eliyahu the prophet would come and visit this pious chassid, this pious rabbi every day, right? In the Talmud, there are all these stories of Eliyahu coming and visiting with different rabbis, studying Torah with them, sharing insights with them, and it's clearly a wondrous thing that this particular rabbi has this relationship with Eliyahu. And not only does he see him, but he sees him every day. But after the gatehouse was built, Eliyahu no longer came to converse with him, no longer came to speak with this particular rabbi. And the Gemara sees this as potentially a rebuke, that it was the building of the gatehouse that stopped Eliyahu from coming anymore to visit the rabbi. And Rashi, in his commentary here, says something very interesting. He basically states that the reason Eliyahu stops coming once the gatehouse is built is because the gatehouse serves a very problematic function for this community. Before the gatehouse was built, the poor could come into the courtyard and ask for tzedakah, and they could receive tzedakah. But once the gatehouse is put up, the poor people can't get in anymore. It's basically become a gated community. And if the poor people can't come in, they're not getting tzedakah. They're not having their needs met by any of the individuals in this community, let alone this particular rabbi. And that seems to be the case as to why Eliyahu stopped coming, right? That this building of the gatehouse was actually morally problematic. It built a wall that kept people out who desperately needed assistance from those inside. And I'll just point out, because again, we know whether it's in the Nevi'im or the prophets or in the Hasidic tradition, there's always this link between the moral and the spiritual, that right, moral sins have spiritual consequences. Right here, the moral sin of building the gatehouse actually keeps Eliyahu, it keeps the divine presence away in one form or another. And there's a Hasidic story I used to love telling at my shul about a poor man on Yom Kippur who wants to daven at the synagogue in his town. And it happens to be a wealthy town and a wealthy synagogue, even though he doesn't have much money. And when he wants to come to the synagogue to daven there, to pray there on Yom Kippur, there's a guard standing out front who won't let him inside. And why won't he be let inside? Because he doesn't have the money to buy a ticket. So the poor man ends up not being able to daven in shul on Yom Kippur, the one day he wants to be with his community to connect with God, and he walks away dejected and sad. As he's walking away from the shul, feeling pretty terrible, he happens to encounter the Ribono Shel Olam. God appears to him, and God asks the poor man, he says, well, why are you so sad? It's Yom Kippur, it's the day of forgiveness. And the man says to God, he says, all he wanted to do was be in shul and be able to talk to you with the community. But I'm not able to do that. They won't let me inside. And God turns to the poor man and he says, well, you know what? Don't worry about it. They don't let me inside there either. Right? And again, what this illustrates is this fundamental truth that when you exclude others, when you hurt others, it has spiritual consequences. And again, that's, I think, in many ways, the straightforward way to read this part of the Gemara here. But what's interesting is when you look a little bit farther, you realize that it's a bit more complicated than this. And in fact, the Gemara's conclusion still seems to be, as you read on here, that you can build a gatehouse. And the Rambam himself, Paskins, decides in the halacha that you can force your neighbors to build a gatehouse, which seems deeply, problematic. I think there's a lot of people who would want to read this section from the Talmud and take away this very straightforward conclusion. Walls are bad. Walls keep people out who are suffering. right? We got to tear down the walls in our communities, in our country, right? I think that's a very natural and legitimate response to this. But at the same time, the Gemara is also challenging that when it concludes that you actually can build a gatehouse for the courtyard, even though it may come with certain spiritual consequences. And that's the question I really want us to spend some time focusing on. That Chazal have this awareness that you can build gates, even though it potentially means keeping poor people out, people who are in need, people who have a moral obligation to. And I want to try to understand why it is Chazal think this way, why it is that we perhaps maybe can't avoid to leave certain people outside of our moral concern. And at the same time, how do Chazal grapple with this? Because that certainly cannot be the end of the story, right? The end of the Jewish story can't be we build a wall to keep the poor people out and that's it, right? If that's the end of the Jewish story, then we're all doomed. So that's the question that we're going to try to dig down and understand a little bit more. To do this, we are going to look at, as I said, three different thinkers, three different modern, more or less modern thinkers. The first is Emmanuel Levinos, who is a name you may have heard before. He was a great Jewish French philosopher, really one of the most influential secular philosophers even of the 20th century. His thoughts had a tremendous influence, still has an influence on what we call continental/European philosophy. He himself was born in Lithuania but moves to France. He is actually in a prisoner of war during the Holocaust, so he doesn't experience it directly, but he does experience World War II in its totality. And much of his writings that he really dedicated his energy to after the war are about this basic question of what are our obligations towards our fellow human beings in this world, right? What are our moral obligations in the wake of the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust? And much of his thought is about trying to make ethics primary to secular philosophy, which hadn't necessarily been the case before the war. Right? His teacher is Heidegger, a German philosopher who is somewhat supportive of the Nazis. And secular philosophy was essentially a handmaiden to some of the horrors of World War II. And Levinos is really trying to offer a corrective to that. And to a certain extent, what his philosophy does is a secularization of Judaism by, to a certain extent, reducing it to ethics. On the other hand, as we know, the ethics is central to Judaism. So what he does, I think, is still very much authentically emerging from the Jewish tradition, right? Rabbi Akiva in the Talmud, when asked what is the most important pasuk of the Torah, he says, "V'ahavta l'recha kamocha," that you should love your fellow as yourself, right? When Hillel is approached by the convert and asked to be taught the Torah on one foot as condition for his conversion, Hillel agrees to it, and he tells him, that which is hateful to you, do not do to others, right? So this idea of reducing Torah to ethics, I don't think is the worst thing in the world by far, and that's to a certain extent what Levinos's philosophy is attempting to do. And for him, I would say the starting point of Judaism's moral philosophy is that human beings are created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Right? This idea emerges from Bereshit, from Genesis, but it's certainly all over Tanakh and rabbinic thought as well. Right? Verse from Bereshit: "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in his image did he make human. Be fruitful then and multiply." Right? We are created in the image of God. Right? To shed the blood of a human being is to shed the blood of that which is of infinite worth and value. For Levinos, right, he takes this very seriously, that human beings are created in the image of God. Because if that's the case, then our encounter with human beings is on some level an encounter with transcendence, with something, that's beyond us, something that is commanding and even maybe threatening to our own existence. And for Levinos, that all gets encapsulated with the metaphor that he uses of this encounter with the face. When we encounter another person, when we encounter their face, that it's almost a revelatory, commanding experience. And again, he comes from a phenomenological tradition within continental philosophy. So a lot of his language sounds, I would say, poetic, and it might even sound a little overwrought to an American audience. But basically what he's pointing out on a fundamental level, it's not easy to look at somebody in the face, If you ever try to look somebody in the eyes, especially a stranger, right, there's something about us that kind of recoils from it. It's almost just too much to be able to take it in. And Levinos sees within that something very, very profound. So just a couple of citations to kind of give you a taste of this. From Totality and Infinity is the major philosophical work in which he explores a lot of this. He says the face resists possession, right? There's something about the face that is beyond our comprehension, our understanding. We can't fully grasp it. It resists my powers to sort of objectify it or control it. In its epiphany, right, it's almost revelatory, the way the face appears to us and the way that we experience it. The sensible, still graspable turns into total resistance to the grasp. This mutation can occur only by the opening of a new dimension, right? The face is beyond us. We can't really make sense of it, and it almost opens us up to something fundamentally different, something fundamentally other. For Levinos, that experience of otherness, of transcendence within the face, that on some levels is an experience of God, he sees as a revelation, and it's a revelation of the commandment, lo tirtzach, that you shall not kill, right? That's what we hear from the face. That's what we hear when we look into the visage of the divine image in the human, right? It's an order. There's a commandment in the appearance of the face as if a master spoke to me. However, at the same time, the face of the other is destitute. It is poor, for whom I can do all and to whom I owe all. And me, whoever I may be, but as a first person, I am he who finds the resources to respond to that call. Right? So we see the face, we feel the commanding nature of its presence, telling us not to kill, that we have this moral obligation to the person in front of us. At the same time, the face also telegraphs the individual or the other's vulnerability, that we could kill them if we really wanted to, if we tried, if we were going to try to perpetrate violence against them. And that sense of being responsible to them in their vulnerability, in their otherness, is what we call ethics. That's what we call morality for Levinos. It's all rooted in that very experience. Just to kind of flesh this out a little bit more, how he sees this emerging from the Jewish tradition and what the implications of it, I'll just give you one more quote from Levinos. He gave a lot of interviews, so there's a lot of collections of his interviews. Interviews are sometimes a little bit of a clearer articulation of his thought. He's asked, text 2 here, does your conception of the face have its roots in Jewish theology? And here's how he answers. He says, in the Old Testament, there is the 6th commandment, thou shalt not kill. This does not mean simply that you are not to go around firing a gun all the time. It refers rather to the fact that in the course of your life, in different ways, you kill someone. For example, when we sit down at the table in the morning and drink coffee, we kill an Ethiopian who doesn't have any coffee. It is in this sense that the commandment must be understood. There is also the phrase, thou shalt love thy neighbor. It is expressed in several ways. There is also, thou shalt love the stranger. So what Levinos is saying here is that the commandment of not killing the other, of being morally responsible to the other in their vulnerability, it's not just about not doing violence to them. It actually means much more than that. It means we have a responsibility to help them, to sustain them in all that we can and in all that they need. That the other makes a total moral claim on us. We owe them whatever we can do to help them. And he takes us to a real extreme here. He says that if you drink coffee in the morning, right, you're basically killing an Ethiopian who doesn't have any coffee, which on the one hand kind of sounds absurd to us. But what Levinos is getting at is, I think, this very deep Jewish insight that we are always responsible for the world, right? It's not something that we can ever escape. It's not easy because we feel it at every moment. And oftentimes, as we're going to discuss, we do our best to deny that sense of absolute responsibility because it comes with a lot of guilt. But that's what it means to be Jewish. You are responsible, right? That's the theme of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, right? You are responsible. You don't have a choice. Most of us don't like this absolute weight of moral responsibility that Levinos is talking about here. Rav Shmuley is one of the few people I know who actually attempts to live up to this, right? To just, you feel that moral obligation and it's continuous and it's absolute, and you just do your best to serve it, knowing that oftentimes we will fall short. Most of us aren't like Rav Shmuley. We kind of know we should, but we don't really want to go that far. We don't want to live with life with the realization that when I have coffee in the morning, that there's real consequences for that, perhaps somewhere else in the world. Now, what's interesting is that even though Levinos says we have this absolute obligation to the other, at the same time, he is aware that you can't live your life like that all the time in your day-to-day life with that kind of awareness. Because we're just one human being at the end of the day. And as he says there, if there were only two of us in the world, you and I, then there wouldn't be any problem, or, there would be no question, then my system would work perfectly, he says, right? Because if there's one other person out there, I owe them as whatever I can do, and there's just one person, I can direct my efforts to them. I'm responsible to the other and everything. But if we're not only two, because if we're at least three, we are now a threesome, we are a humanity. And this is the problem that Levinos understands, is that our absolute obligation really can only play out to one person at a time at most. And the world is full of more people. So if that's the case, then we always have a challenge. We always have to decide if and where we're going to direct our moral energies, knowing that somebody's going to get left out. And he says, in approaching in charity, the first one to come along, the I runs the risk of being uncharitable toward the third party, right? If you're going to give to this person, that effectively means you're not going to be able to give to another. And that's what it means to live in the real world, even though we have these unending moral responsibilities. It's very, very challenging what he's laying out here. He says in the last text here, if there was no order of justice, there would be no limit to my responsibility. Justice for him is sort of politics and the everyday life of the world in which we live, the reality of the world. And he goes on to say that we live in a world of citizens. We don't live not only in the order of the face-to-face, right? Face-to-face means absolute responsibility. That's what we kind of know, but it's not the way we live our lives, because you can't live your lives that way. The world's too many people. The world's too complex. Now, essentially what Levinos is offering us here is a bit of a paradox, in that we have this absolute obligation to the other, and we must do all that we can for them. That's the ideal. But at the same time, we live in a world where this isn't possible. We have to always be balancing our moral obligations towards many different people. So for Levinos, if we think back to that Gemara we saw, we build that gate because we simply have no choice. We're human. We have ethical obligations towards our family, towards our neighbors, and there are a lot of situations where they're going to have to come first. And we are at nearly all times forced to privilege some over others. However, even though Levinos allows for the fact that you're going to have to build a gate, and there may be others that are out there who you cannot help, he also makes it clear, in spite of this, that we can never forget our obligations towards the other, our moral obligations to those beyond our gate, right? The poor, the needy, the homeless, the refugee. And for Levinos, it would be the highest evil to think that we can build that gate and then absolve ourselves of all responsibility to the other outside of it. And for Levinos, we should feel guilty perpetually that we can and should do more, even if we don't feel that we're able to, because that guilt is a sign that we feel the moral obligation that comes with being human. And I just want to add one more point to that I think is significant, even though he doesn't say this explicitly, but I think it's the implication of his moral philosophy. If I'm always responsible to the other, but I can't live up to that responsibility at all times, I'm going to feel guilty. And what's going to happen is that seeing a poor person is probably going to make me feel exceptionally guilty. Because though I may try to do something to help them, maybe give them money, maybe I'm fighting for social political change to help them, but in the end, I know in that moment, I will most often not be able to transform their lives. I can't just make them no longer poor and give them a whole life again. And knowing this has an important consequence, because if seeing a poor person makes me feel guilty, and I know I should help them like Levinos says, but I can never help them completely, then what's going to probably happen is I'm going to go out of my way not to see people who are in need. Because if I have to see them, I'm going to feel guilty, and I don't want to feel guilty. So I think this point is important, even though Levinos doesn't say it, is that we keep the other away, the one who is in need, because we don't want to feel guilty, because we know we're supposed to help them, and we don't really know how, and we don't really know if we can, and we don't want to feel that way. So we just try to keep them out of our sight entirely. So this is the approach of Levinos, and we're going to come back to it. What I want to look at now is the approach of Slavoj Zizek, which in many ways complements that of Levinos, even though in his own writings he often disagrees with Levinos on this. Slavoj Zizek is a very interesting philosopher, cultural critic. He's often associated with what we call what's often referred to as post-structuralism or postmodernism. And you could certainly make the argument that he's the most influential philosopher and social critic alive today, particularly outside of America. And his writings combine the psychoanalytic philosophy of Jacques Lacan with Hegel and Marx. And what he basically uses all these thinkers to do is launch a comprehensive critique of basically every truth we take for granted in modern life. While at the same time, he also tries to point us to important moral truths that we've often ignored and that modernity is often ignored. And for Zizek, what he points out is most of what we consider morality, what we might call liberal morality, modern morality, is based on empathy and identification with the other, right? We do good for others because we feel their pain, because we identify with them. We see them within us to a certain extent, one extent or another. Now, this may sound kind of obvious, right? Yeah, that's what morality is, right? You care for the other, you love the other, you feel for the other, you identify for the other. But Zizek points out that actually can be problematic because basically it has a huge blind spot. And what Mara Rudy here, who's a scholar who writes on Zizek amongst others, she summarizes his argument quite nicely. She says here in the bolded part, she says, according to Zizek, such an ethics of identification and empathy relies on the assumption that we can treat the other as a fellow human being, as someone just like us, when in fact we have no foundation for positing such a platform of commonality, right? It sounds nice to say, like, we're all human, we're all the same, right? If we get beyond that which makes us different, we'll find all that we share. But the reality is, you can easily make the argument that what human beings, what makes us different from each other is far, far, far greater, oftentimes, than what we share, at least how we experience other human beings. And basically then what Zizek is saying is that if our morality is only based on identification and empathy, it only works to the extent that we can, as Rudy says, sideline everything about the other that is not compatible with our inherited conception of what it means to be a human being. Basically, if my morality is based on empathy and identification, then the only way it works is if I can get rid of everything about that person that challenges my empathy and identification for them. And Rudy goes on to say, with Zizek, this is exactly why our empathy tends to falter the moment the other no longer makes sense to us, the moment he or she deviates from our understanding of what constitutes reasonable human conduct, as is the case when we are confronted by a suicide bomber, a religious fanatic, or someone else whose actions correspond to our definition, or don't correspond to our definition of acceptable behavior, our well-meaning rhetoric of tolerance. Meaning for Zizek, morality works right up until you encounter the monster, right up until you encounter somebody who defies your understanding of what it means to be human. And when we encounter the monster, we don't want to have anything to do with them. We don't feel any kind of ethical responsibility to them whatsoever. And you might think, well, maybe there's a few monsters out there in the world, but there's not that many of them. But as Zizek points out, that's not exactly the case, that we exclude so many people from our moral concern, again, because we feel that they are monstrous, that they scare us, that they're different, that there's something weird or very strange about them. And that happens all the time. I mean, there's always others who essentially function as, again, monsters for us. I'll give you I'll read the Zizek, who says it himself. He says, this is a quote from his book dealing with the refugee problem. And again, for refugees, right, when the rhetoric that is often used about refugees, again, prevents people from seeing them as helpless, vulnerable human beings. It almost turns them into these dangerous, scary, potential monsters and threats. He says universality is a universality of strangers. At the end of the day, we're all strangers to each other, of individuals reduced to the abyss of impenetrability in relation not only to others, but also to themselves. We don't understand ourselves most of the time, and we certainly don't understand others. And that's why he says the privileged way to reach a neighbor is not that of empathy, but of trying to even understand them, but rather a disrespectful laughter, which makes fun both of them and of us, right? The only way to overcome the sense of the monster is to just realize we're all kind of monstrous. We're all kind of strange and weird, and to be able to acknowledge that and laugh at that. And that's the only way, he says, we're able to really overcome this, this fear that we have of the monster that forces us to exclude them from the, from our concern. Now, part of the reason I'm very drawn to this idea, Zizek himself is not Jewish, though he does write a lot about Judaism in certain places and stuff like that. But the reason I think it's so interesting for us as Jews is, do you know who was the other, who was the monster for most of the last 2,000 years for Europe and Christianity, right? It was the Jew. We were the other. We were the one outside of their moral concern. We were the one who were not part of their, covenantal, community, not deserving of their love. And because we were monstrous, right, we could be treated as such. And I want to give an example of this that's kind of shocking, but it gets to the heart of sort of the challenge of what happens when we look at empathy or morality simply through the lens of empathy and identification. This is a painting from the 14th century France. It's called The Jew Dragon. And I think it's in a cathedral. I'd have to double check. But you see, this is the Jew here. And you can see it presents it in the most horrific and monstrous way, right? There's different appendages and limbs, and it's devouring people, right? This is the way the Jews were viewed in sort of the European Christian imagination, completely other and completely monstrous. And so this idea that there's an other out there who's a monster, right, who we exclude from our moral concern, I think is a part of the universal, human condition. And it's something that we have to take very seriously. Because again, we all have others. We all have others who we see as monsters in one way or another. So just to summarize for the moment, going back to that Gemara, the original Gemara, for Zizek, we build the gate, and we're allowed to build the gate to keep the monsters out. Not necessarily because they're evil, though we may think of that too, but because their differences and strangeness and otherness is traumatic when we experience too much of it too intensely. That's why we're pushing the other way. Their monstrousness, we just can't handle it. As a result, we don't want to give to those who are not like us, right? That's why we build the gate. We don't want to give to those that scare us or shock us with their difference. That's the approach of Zizek. And for Levinos, we build that gate because we have no choice. We can't help everyone. That's the reality of being human and juggling all the competing moral obligations we have to different people in the world. But this still doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to the other, to the face of the one who is in need. Inevitably, we feel guilty that we can't help everybody, as Levinos points out, and that guilt causes us time and time again to push the other even farther away, so that we don't have to feel any guilt. And I think if we go back to the story too, right, the poor people, the homeless, right, they often embody both of these elements for us. Right, the homeless is other in a monstrous sense. They look destitute. You don't feel that they're part of society. Their clothes are torn. They're dirty. Perhaps they might have mental illness. They might be addicted to drugs. Right? There's something monstrous that makes it very difficult when you encounter somebody who's homeless. And at the same time, you feel this tremendous guilt because you should help them. How could you not? They're a human being who's in terrible shape, but you don't know how, and you don't know if you can, and even if you tried, you probably couldn't transform everything. So what are you going to do at the end of the day? Right, so I think the poor, the homeless often embodies both of these in very profound ways. That's why gated communities exist, to keep them, out. The same with refugees. They often embody the monstrousness and the fears that we project on them. And we feel so guilty because we know they have nothing and they're dying, literally. And we don't know what to do about that. We don't know what we can do to help them and change their situation. And again, with that comes all this guilt. So we just try to push them even farther out of our mind. So, because the rabbis understood that we live in a world of gates and that will at least cause us at times to exclude others from a moral concern, they still want to try to understand, what do we do about this? Because again, this can't be the end of the story. And what it does is that if you live in a world of gates, it makes the mitzvah of tzedakah very, very complicated. And the rabbis understand this. I want to look at two Talmudic stories real briefly that show the challenges of tzedakah in a world of gates. It's the rabbis almost ironically struggling with, you could say, Levinos and Zizek, even though obviously they lived much, much later. But you'll see how in these two stories of tzedakah, these are basically tzedakah fails. These are places where tzedakah did not happen the way it should have because of the issues that Levinos and Zizek raised. So the first story, I'm not going to read it inside because we don't have time. It's about Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, great rabbinic leader after the destruction of the Second Temple. He's the one who really leads the project of the Mishnah, of organizing it and codifying it. And he's a significant rabbinic leader in terms of shaping rabbinic and Jewish culture going forward for centuries. And what happens is in a time of famine, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who's the rabbinic leader, and he's wealthy, so he's a political leader as well, he opens the storehouses of grain, but only for those who are learned in Torah. He will not give any grain in a time of famine, even to Jews, if they are an am haaretz, which is the rabbinic terminology for someone who's a Jewish illiterate, who doesn't know anything. He basically, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is only going to give tzedakah to people like him. And to a certain extent, this makes sense because Rebbe is an ideological visionary. He's trying to reconstitute Judaism. And the tendency of ideological projects is they exclude a lot of people oftentimes because they're trying to bring about a certain vision of the world. And that vision, often to be imposed on reality, means pushing certain people out of the way. And what happens in the story here is that one of his students, Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram, pretends to be an Am Haaretz and goes to Rebbe to beg for food. And what happens is when Rebbe sees him, he doesn't recognize him. He initially refuses, doesn't want to give him food because he thinks he's an Am Haaretz. He doesn't deserve it. And Rabbi Yonatan says, well, don't give me because I'm learned, because I'm not. He's pretending. Feed me as the dog and the raven are fed. What he's saying to Rebbe is, if I'm not human to you because I'm not a learned rabbi, at least show kindness to me as you would an animal. And with that, Rebbe is willing to give him food. But the story goes on to say that Rebbe actually feels upset. He feels bad that he gave food to who he thought was an Am Haaretz. And what happens is his son then goes and checks and discovers that it wasn't really an Am Haaretz. It was Rabbi Yonatan in disguise. And Rebbe then feels better because he realized he didn't have to give to the other at the end of the day. He didn't have to give to this Am Haaretz. And for Rebbe, it's clear. His other is the Am Haaretz. They are his monsters in the sense of Zizek. And therefore, they are outside the gates for him. And what's interesting is for him, he has a good reason for this, why they're monstrous. At the end of the story, he actually declares here in the bolded part, he says, it is the unlearned, the Am Haaretz, who brings misfortune to the world, right? He thinks the Am Haaretz are the problem. They're the ones undermining the ideal society he's trying to. They're wicked to a certain extent. He said basically their profound ignorance, their lack of reverence for Torah, makes them fundamentally opposed to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's highest values, and as a result, they're the enemy, the ones getting in the way of the better world Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is trying to create, and therefore they're outside of his gate. They're monsters. They're beyond his moral concern. Right? It's a tzedakah failure here, clearly. And it's fascinating how the Gemara is sort of aware of all these dynamics, even as it presents it in a slightly, neutral fashion. In the next story, a story from the Yerushalmi, this is a story of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, another pair of famous rabbinic sages, a chavruta, study partners. And they were traveling together to go to the baths of Tiberia, the hot springs. And while they're about to walk into the baths, they encounter a beggar. And the beggar does what beggars do. He asks them for money. And they say to him that when we come out of the bath, we will give it to you. I mean, we're not going to give you money now, but we'll give you when we're done. We want to go in the bath now. We want to relax. However, when they came out, they discovered that the beggar had died. And this was kind of a shock for them. They said, since we did not merit to give to him in his life, let's at least do so in death. We didn't give him tzedakah when he was alive, so let's try to do tzedakah for him now. We'll take care of him, make sure he gets a proper burial. And as they're preparing the body to be washed, they are looking under his clothing, and they discover he's got a wallet on his neck, this beggar, with 600 dinar inside, which means he wasn't really poor at the end of the day. He was deceiving them. And then they say this fascinating line. They say, blessed is God that he chose in the sages in their words. For as Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, we must thank those beggars who are liars. Or we have to thank the beggars who are liars because basically they get us off the hook. Right? The fact we know there are some lying beggars out there means we don't have to feel guilty if we don't give to everybody. Right? So it's a really fascinating Gemara. They know they're morally obligated to this guy, but they don't give to him when they should. when they come out and they see that he's dead, they clearly feel guilty about it. In the Levinasian sense, they kind of feel like murderers. They know they should have helped him. They feel tremendous guilt. But then they discover, well, he didn't really deserve it in the first place, and therefore they can finally get off their guilt. They don't have to feel bad that they had this, again, what was clearly another tzedakah failure, where they failed to give to the other because they didn't want to feel the guilt, and they wanted to push him outside their moral concern. And again, we do this all the time, right? We make these excuses about a poor person. They're lazy. They don't really need the money. If I give them money, it's just going to fuel a drug habit. We use these excuses to get us off the hook, so that we have that guilt, that tremendous moral obligation we have, so we can push the other way and not feel bad about it. So we live in a world with gates because we couldn't exist. We couldn't be human beings and have a human society without it. It's easy to give tzedakah to someone like you, as Zizek pointed out, someone we can identify with, someone we can relate to, someone who's part of our ideological worldview. It's easy to find excuses why we don't have to give to the other, so that we can avoid feeling that absolute moral responsibility that Levinos reminded us that we all have, and we don't have to feel the guilt that comes along with it. So then the question becomes, what does real tzedakah look like in a world with gates that we're not just going to tear down? And I think what we have to keep in mind is that tzedakah is fundamentally, for the rabbis, about confronting the other. It means giving tzedakah in a way that doesn't necessarily make us feel better, that's not going to wipe away all that guilt that we have that comes with that moral responsibility that we can never fully live up to. And it means giving tzedakah to an other who is not like us, an other who will never be inside our gate. Rather, they're going to always be strange and unsettling to us. And when we keep all this in mind, what it means is tzedakah is really, really hard to give to that other who is outside our moral concern, who's outside of our gate. And this brings us to Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, and we'll finish with him. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, one of the great Hasidic rabbis, he's the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. He really returns Hasidut to its radical roots of his Zaidi, of his grandfather. By the time Rabbi Nachman comes around, Hasidut has lost some of its edge. He really tries to bring that back, and you'll see that in the following text. His Torah is definitely one of bringing comfort to the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. Right? He really does that in all aspects. But I think he also really understands the full implications of tzedakah, of our moral obligation to the other, as laid out by Levinos and Zizek, and as Chazal clearly are grappling with. For Rabbi Nachman, tzedakah, giving to the other, means turning cruelty, achzariut, into compassion, into rachmanut. If you have to give to a monstrous other who's strange and different, and maybe scary and evil to you, it's not something you're going to want to do. It's going to be very, very hard to do. Meaning the act of real tzedakah, as Rabbi Nachman is going to call it, he calls it an avoda, it's work, it's labor, is something that is going to be hard. And he says here, initially when a person begins donating charity tzedakah, right, he has to break this heartlessness and cruelty that they feel and turn it into compassion. This is the essential devotion of tzedakah, right? When you encounter the other, right, you don't want to give to them. You don't want to open up your wallet. You don't want to open up your hand to them. And we've all had this instinct in our lives in countless times, in countless moments. We know that internal feeling of just like, I don't want to give. I don't want to do this, right? And I think when we encounter the other who's a true other, right, that's when we really feel it, right? It's much easier to give when you can give to somebody who's like you. And it's much easier to give when you can give in a way that makes you feel like you've solved all the problems. Right, but that's not that doesn't happen very often, and it's not where the true ethical act lies for certainly not for Rabbi Nachman. And he says here, beginning the devotion of tzedakah is very difficult and demanding. All devotions and all acts of repentance, he actually calls tzedakah a form of tshuva because it just fundamentally requires you to transform your whole orientation. It's so difficult, he says, that you actually have to like moan and groan and make gesticulations as a way of like overcoming the internal resistance you have to be able to do it, right? That's what it requires to really give to the other, to the one outside your gates. It's like a fight. It's an internal fight that you have to have with yourself to be able to do it. He says you got to cry out, oy vavoy, like it's not something that's going to come easy. He actually likens it to the act of birth, to childbirth, because it's so painful. but also transformative, right? It actually brings something new, a true moral ethical act to the other. It actually brings something new into existence. It brings the possibility of a relationship into existence where there simply wasn't any before. He says here, all tzedakah is a beginning. It's a hatchala. It's a beginning in the sense that it says in the book of Devarim that you shall open your hand to him, to the poor person, right? Everywhere there's an opening and a beginning already exists, charity opens more and more, widening the opening further. All beginnings are hard, he says, a famous rabbinic statement, right? In the very beginning of a true moral act of giving to the other is incredibly, incredibly hard. But for Rabbi Nachman, it's a transformative act because, again, it brings you into relationship with somebody where there simply wasn't any relationship there before. And he talks about this idea of it making an opening of some kind. And what's interesting, part of the reason I like that, is that if you look back at that original Gemara from Bava Batra, it says you can build a gate on your neighbor in your courtyard, but that gate has to have an opening in it. Because you can have a gate, but there has to be a way for you to see the other, for the other to see you, for the other to stick their hand in, and for you to give to them. And without that opening in the gate, it's just a wall, and a wall serves one fundamental purpose, and that's to keep people out. And the act of tzedakah is oftentimes about making sure that our gates have holes in them, they have windows in them, that they have a way that they can be open. So as I said, you can see the other, you can give to them, and they can fundamentally receive. And I know for me in my own life, part of the reason I'm drawn to this whole topic is because I experienced it viscerally a lot as a synagogue rabbi. As a synagogue rabbi, I had a very diverse community socioeconomically, and we were in a much larger community of Jews, which meant that we had people who come to our shul all the time in need, Jews from all different places. And it's one thing, when you're a rabbi trying to do tzedakah and organizing tzedakah for people inside your shul. You know them, you care about them, you feel for them. You know that your efforts are rewarded because you can see it. Like you can see how your energy has an impact on them and can change their lives. It's much harder when somebody just shows up at your doorstep. You don't know who they are, and you probably will never see them again. And oftentimes they come with a sob story, and you don't know, do they really need it? Do they not? Is my helping them maybe just encouraging them? You make those excuses like the rabbis did. He's lying, they're deceiving me. I'm not really obligated here. I can push them away. And I'm sorry to say, a lot of times people would come to the shul I did not know, and I would let my cynicism or my skepticism or my guilt, I'm pushing away the guilt, get the better of me. And I wouldn't give to them. And it took me a couple of years before I was able to force myself to consistently give to people who were really other to me. We said Haredim, ultra-Orthodox, come to the shul from Israel. And they were other in a very different way. They didn't share my values. They would show up and come to our daily minyan with their hands out asking for money. And it was extraordinarily difficult for me to say, well, do I give to you or not? Is this where my responsibility is or not? Your values are so different from mine. But what I learned is that if I was willing to able to try to push myself, as Rabbi Nachman said, through that great spiritual moral labor that's like childbirth, of forcing myself to give to the other, that something transformative can happen, and that's what the rabbis are striving for with tzedakah. We live in a world of gates. We can't avoid that, but that doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to others. There's always an other out there we exclude, and tzedakah is all about striving to live up to our moral responsibilities to them. And it's hard. It's, a true moral ethical act is really hard. And if it's not hard, it's probably not the kind of moral ethical act that is directed towards a true other.
Wow.
I'll end with that, Reb Shmuley.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much. That was so rich. There's just so much there. Thank you for giving over all that and so powerfully. Friends, let's open it up. Feel free to unmute yourself if you would now like to ask a question in our remaining 10 minutes.
Well, I'll just add one more note because we are heading into election season. I think, for a lot of us, those who are in the alternative political party are very much an other for us, or a monstrous other. I mean, on both sides. And there may be some, truth for that, but I think it's, as I was preparing the shiur, I was thinking a lot about that. Who is my other? Who is our other? And the more ideologically polarized we become, the more there are others out there. And the more there are others out there, I mean, this is the experience of the Jewish people. Like, the greater there is, not just to moral exclusion, but to violence. So I think this is something that we're living viscerally, whether we like it or not. That there are more and more others, and there's something dangerous that comes along with that if we don't know how to be moral, to act, to strive to act ethically towards them.
Yeah, one of our shared teachers, Rabbi Avi Weiss, in his book Spiritual Activism, talks about how one of the principles of spiritual activism is how we perceive the opposition. In that regard, how you can robustly work for your cause but never lose the dignity of the opposition in some sense.
And it's so hard. It's so hard. Look, one of the things I appreciate about Rav Shmuley is that, I mean, you're a friend of mine, so maybe it's, you've been open to me because of that, but you're very open when ethical acts are easier for you and when they're really hard for you. And you don't just you're not just like, well, it's always easy, you just got to do the right thing. Like, no, morality isn't, like I said, if it's not hard, then you're missing something, fundamental. And I think, that's an important thing too in our times where there's so many ethical challenges and dilemmas we're facing. To pretend as if they're all easy and obvious is just, again, missing something fundamental, because we do live in a world with gates in which, there are going to be times where the moral decisions are quite complicated.
Rabbi, if you have limited resources and time, which everyone does, there's no such thing as unlimited resources and unlimited time. If I, as a female, say, well, I don't want to donate to people who deny my humanity or my equality as a Jew, is there something morally wrong with that? And I say I want to prioritize my Jewish tzedakah to organizations that don't deny my humanity.
Right. No, I think that's a very important point. And again, like our moral concern should guide our tzedakah. So I think, it's interesting about the halachot, the laws of tzedakah, is how they direct us to give. And so I think one of the things that they do, which is significant, is that when it comes to like causes and organizations, again, that's up to us to decide, where we give and how we give. Right? There's no real halachot that can tell us, you have to give to this organization or that organization. But where halacha is sort of inescapable is in relation to those who are proximal to you, geographically, physically, right? Meaning if you encounter a person like on the street, like you have a real obligation to them. Your neighbor, the person next to you, who lives next to you, you have a real obligation to them. So in that sense, I think, when it comes to the causes, we can do what, we should feel that we're justified to give where we give. But we have to also look around us, like literally around us. Who are our neighbors, who live across the street, who are in my town? And regardless of what their ideologies might be or their beliefs, I have a moral obligation to them. I mean, and we just can't escape that. And I think part of the challenge is making sure there's a space in our tzedakah to acknowledge that, right? That, again, it's not that all tzedakah or all ethical acts have to be about giving to the other, but the problem is too often people's morality consists of never giving to the other. And that's where there's a real dilemma.
I have something to say on that, but I want to see if someone else wants to share first. Yeah. Okay. So Judy, it's a great question, and I think it's challenging. And Reb Zach, I'm interested to hear your thought on this. Do we care what others think of us or what they believe when in the need to support them? Let me give an example. Like 20-ish years ago, there was a natural disaster in Iran, and a Jewish humanitarian relief group was going to offer aid, raise aid, and Iran said, we won't accept Jewish money. And so the group had a choice. Do we care more about saving lives, and so we're going to raise this money and donate this money, and we'll say it's not from Jews? Or do we care more about being in some respectful relationship? And if you don't want our money, Jewish money, then forget you. You go get your own money. You can acknowledge it's from Jews or not. And so what's the right thing to do there? To save lives, or to say you don't acknowledge who I am, you don't acknowledge my dignity, so I want nothing to do with you. Or here's another case. I obviously don't think that everyone who's involved in Black Lives Matter is anti-Israel, although certainly people most certainly are. But do I care in supporting? Do I care when I say, standing up for justice for black men being killed matters enough that I will donate to you regardless of what you think of me or do for me. So too, one might say, if rape is wrong, you're always anti-rape. You don't say, oh, I'm only anti-rape in the case where the person being raped is someone who thinks I'm a good person or is a decent person herself. So, no, rape is wrong regardless of who she is. So I wonder, and I wonder how we think about this. Like, sometimes we think, and Reb Zach, I'm curious, like, we donating is almost investing in someone. I'm investing in your future because I care about you, as opposed to just a level of dignity itself. So curious.
So I think, again, there's never a singular answer to these questions. That's what makes them so tough. I'll say this. So, I was kind of cheating a little bit with Levinos, and, in the way I was framing it, such that by giving to the other, it creates a relationship with them. That's not exactly the case for Levinos. For Levinos, you looking into the face of the other can also be understood as like almost looking into the abyss. That there can never be a real relationship with the otherness of the other. It is what it is. And yet at the same time, I still have that moral obligation, meaning even without reciprocity, I still have that moral obligation. He says this in regards to like Nazis, like we still have this ethical moral obligation to them, even if they're, trying to kill us. On the other hand, as we saw, we always are going to have to be balancing moral obligations to multiple places and multiple times. So like for the Iran example, like whether they acknowledge or accept us or not, if people are dying, like we have a responsibility. For the Black Lives Matter, question, again, then it may raise this issue of like all these competing moral obligations I have. I have an absolute obligation to people who are suffering from, systemic racism. But if it's going to increase other aspects of immorality, I have to balance that too, right? So Levinos is aware, of that dilemma. So look, I tend to be a follower of Yushmali in the sense that like we can't ignore our moral obligations, but at the same time, Levinos never says that that means we should pretend like the people we're giving to are perfect or are innocent, right? And that's the big problem. That's where a lot of this rubber hits the road. There is no perfect recipient of tzedakah. You learn that very quickly too if you're a rabbi, right? Everybody who needs tzedakah, everybody who needs help, there's aspects about them that are innocent and deserving of grace. And there's aspects about them, like every human being, that are kind of horrific and scary. And you kind of have to be willing to acknowledge both of those and name both of those things. And again, I think the goal is just to do good and turn a blind eye to everything else. That's also like a huge problem in its own right.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff. So much was packed into this hour of Jewish import, of demonstrating how other philosophers can be of value in thinking of various frameworks. And I'm very grateful to you for calling in so late at night in Israel. And friends, I hope you'll continue to Google Rabbi Truboff, because his writings always have academic depth and spiritual fervor, morally robust. So we look forward to continuing our learning together. We have stuff going on every day. So join us next week at all kinds of amazing things. Just one thing to highlight. We're doing a rabbinic tribute to Rabbi Micah Kaplan of blessed memory, Monday from 1 to 2. About 10 rabbis are going to offer some Torah towards him. I have my malacha, my Lamed Tet class on Shabbat coming every Tuesday at 10. And a whole bunch of other classes. Our Hammerman Lecture series, our Hammerman Lecture talk with Daniel Gordis is next Thursday at 11 to 12:30. So thank you, Rabbi Truboff. Thank you all for joining us.